February 25, 2022 started as a typical day of work for the men of LMCs. Making a plunge point of Pierre, they were to play out some support errands on a pipeline for outsider fuel. An administration claimed oil organization in Trinidad and Tobago as expert jumpers for Kazim, Ali Jr., Yusuf, Henry Faisal, Kurbin, Rishi Nagasar, and Chris Budram. It was simply one more day of work. They would be dealing with a segment of line that was not in current use. It was a U-molded pipeline between the region where an oil big hauler would pull up to offload its oil called berth 5 and the region where the oil enters the treatment facility called berth 6. To play out their work for the day, they would need to isolate the line from the seawater to get to the areas that required fix to do this. They put an exceptional living space ringer over the line. This framework would permit the water to be driven down over the line, so they could have a dry work environment. The territory was an 8-foot by 8-foot shape structure put over the top piece of the line after air is blown inside to uproot. The water, the men could remain on the edge to play out their work in a hyperbaric chamber. This permitted them to eliminate their jumping gear and securely use devices to perform complex fixes and moves. As a gathering, one of the errands they needed to finish was the evacuation of an inflatable fitting upon entering the World 6. This fitting had been embedded very nearly 14 days before to safeguard the oil items in the line and prevent any hydrocarbons from getting away from this attachment, was a water-air-proof hindrance that clasped against the tension pushing down from the living space. Chamber a wrench was recovered to release the valve on the fitting. Kazim Ali missed the wrench to the 4 men working around the line. Then he maneuvered himself up onto the edge to eliminate his jumping gear when the valve was opened. A stunning power quickly overwhelmed the gathering. Water hurried into the living space and down into the line. Right now. Flush of water maneuvered the men and all of their hardware into a twister of water whirling down the pipeline. It was unforeseen to such an extent that they scarcely comprehended what was really happening to them. Such an unfortunate second, they were very lucky to settle from the water in a spot that had an air pocket for breathing. The GoPro video caught the men at the times, not long prior to being sucked in. Then everything went totally dark as you hear the stirring and development. It's stunning to hear them begin to talk. They were truly yelling at one another inside this line that should be brimming with unrefined petroleum. The terrible incongruity is that this air that was permitting them to inhale was, in reality, the reason for the whirling water twister that brought them here. So how precisely did this happen? The inflatable fitting that they were eliminating should isolate 1,200 barrels of oil from the air and seawater around it. All things considered, it would have involved everyday practice to eliminate the fitting and continue with their work plan. The gaseous tension in the living space would have been pushing down on a weighty section of oil. The oil would have been settled level between the 2 line openings upon entering the World 5 and 6. Nothing out of the standard. Sadly, they had no clue about that. There was a segment of air under that fitting and significantly less oil in the length of the line. When the attachment was collapsed, the high-tension air from the living space hurried down the line with such power it pulled the men their device and scuba tanks into the 30-inch pipeline in light of the fact that the natural surroundings pressure was unexpectedly delivered. The seawater savagely pushed inside and twirled into the line with the men. In a wild whirl of air, seawater, and instruments were 5 men battling for breath. After what probably felt like an unfathomable length of time, the whirling settled and they ended up in a pocket of air. Chris Budram, the last one standing, portrayed the unimaginable snapshot of being sucked into an oil pipeline like this. So quick after that, all I recollect that I didn't actually recall really getting Pullini pipe. I simply recollect going entire Judy pipe at mind-blowing speeds. I can pause my breathing. Never again. I'm a reality, and it will hinder for a really long time sooner or later. Your body never again battle, definitely. We as close as youthful clamor. An unfathomable bad dream, your eyes consuming each time I attempt to open your eyes. It's consuming. Definitely completely dark. I can't not see anything. Your reality consuming your ears, ringing your body sore. And by then I let myself know I was continuing dead once they halted. The men took a fast stock of where they were, the manner by which they were feeling, and whether every one of the 5 men had made it. They started yelling to and fro to see as one another, and affirmed that they genuinely were inside the line together. It was simply so mind-boggling yet. It was the terrible reality attempting to grasp where they were in the pipeline was much harder than it appears. They were totally muddled and had no clue about how far they'd dropped down the line. This pipeline segment was 1,200 feet in length, up to 4 football handles. The line had undulations at weld creases or where supports were put. These varieties in rise permitted air pockets to frame once they got their direction. Obviously, they were undeniably battered yet alive in all the bewilderment. They weren't in arrangement with regards to which heading would lead them back to berth 6. After some conversation, they chose to connect together and mix collectively toward one of the closures. The whole line was covered with thick, dangerous oil slime. It was debilitating to continue to battle against the oil and scarcely moving, while at the same time managing broken bones, battered organs, oil in their eyes and nostrils. And all of this in complete obscurity. Sooner or later, subsequent to battling for an hour, they experienced a stunning issue. The seawater level was rising. They were holding their heads. Over the water, however, the preferred choice saw that his face was currently just 6 crawls from the highest point of the line. It was absolutely impossible to proceed with. Like this, a portion of the men were truly harmed and wouldn't have the option to move significantly longer. At any rate, Chris Boudram and Kazim Ali were the initial 2 driving, the gathering different men. Yusuf, Faisal, and Rishi were the following 3 in the line. It was concluded that Chris and Kazim would attempt to pause their breathing and check whether they could find one more pocket of air. They guaranteed the men that they would battle to get out and get back with assistance for everybody. The 2 men held their countenances high in the water to the extent that this would be possible, then paused their breathing to swim forward, searching for air. Their battle carried them to a second pocket of air, nearer to the riser pipe that could lead them out. They were elated to find 2 of their scuba tanks resting in this part. It seemed like this was all they expected to make their break. They nearly utilized the 2 containers of oxygen to travel through the following segment, yet Kazim's wounds were getting more serious and he couldn't move rapidly together. They concluded that it would be best for Chris to take what was left of the oxygen and make a dip for the finish of the line to get help. He set the tank before his body and moved it along as he pressed forward in a limited over 2-foot tube. When he got to the riser end of the line, he was hit with a startling idea. Imagine a scenario where this was berth 5 and not berth 6. He would swim up almost 60 feet and basically run into a swelled fitting. There would be no air and his tank was practically vacant. He set a request and drove over the base to advance toward the surface after over 2 hours in the line. Chris was feeling better to find he had arrived at the highest point of the slick water. Upon entering the world 6, he banged and shouted to attempt to definitely stand out. Of the remainder of the boat group, one of the searchers at last found him and assisted him with moving out with a chain. Chris was overpowered and depleted. He made sense of that there were air pockets in the line and that every one of the men were as yet alive. He was hurried to the clinic. Subsequent to telling heroes that there was air and that they were harmed yet alive. Up until this point, different individuals from LMCs didn't know if they might really be alive. They expected that the line was brimming with oil and the men would have suffocated in minutes. They likewise realized that any oxygen tanks would endure as long as an hour every. It had been over 2 hours since the men had been sucked into the pipeline. However, at last, this was a hint of something to look forward to once. Chris made sense of the circumstance jumpers in the water tapped on the line, in various areas. and got a tap accordingly from inside. The caught men probably felt overpowering help, that somebody realizes that they are inside. They realize that proficient jumpers and gear, everything being equal, would be out on the boat above them. Oxygen tanks, rope lights help a large number of hours. They stood by to see a flash of light or hear the metal clank of oxygen. Brings descending. Yet they saw nothing. They heard nothing, in addition to the fact that they were enduring with their wounds supported in the underlying flush they presently battled to raise the harsh, sleek air every hour expanded the carbon dioxide content of this restricted air supply, so breathing would turn out to be increasingly difficult. Thus they stood by, regardless of how the disaster of the non-salvage came about. It is a frantically miserable reality that these men were only 200 or 300 feet from salvation. Yet nobody at any point came. They battled in torment, thumped for consideration, and endeavored to move themselves to the leave. It probably been a devastating acknowledgement. After days trapped in the slick line, nobody was coming. The moves made by LMC's untouchable fuel, their affiliated business legacy, and the coast gatekeeper are highly discussed. It is asserted by some that Untouchable kept jumpers from entering the line to save different men. Outsider cases that there was no reasonable arrangement to get the men out without endangering more lives. Some accept that the men were surely dead and the banging was from something different. The coast watchmen, LMCs, and relatives, who were proficient jumpers, all have their own adaptation of the occasions, the realities. That can't be denied are these 4 men were alive at 5 o'clock on Friday. When Chris Budrum was protected, many individuals concur that they heard beating on the lines from inside for almost 48 hours before it halted after the bodies had been recuperated. 2 post-mortems were performed. However, the dissections disagreed on the hour of death. Plainly, every one of the men lived until different times on Saturday, and some seem to have lived until Monday. We don't know whether the men capitulated to their wounds or ran out of breathable air or even suffocated, attempting to swim to one of the line exits. A commission of request was shaped in Trinidad and Tobago. Their discoveries are planned to be delivered in August of 2023 on the grounds that all that inside. My perspective, what's happening, no one was making our consideration.